They told her humans were monsters, so when the peace treaty demanded she marry one, she expected a beast wrapped in armor, reeking of fresh blood and ash. Instead, she got Christian, a man who smelled of engine oil and stale coffee, who apologized when he accidentally bumped his shoulder into door frames. She thought she had been sold to a pathetic, soft weakling just to secure a borderline. She was entirely wrong. It took 3 years, a shattered treaty, and a squad of elite assassins to realize she hadn't married a diplomat. She had married a dormant god of war. The dress was a synthetic nightmare. Diana stood in the holding room of the neutral station, her fingernails digging into the stiff, pearlescent fabric cutting into her ribs. It was supposed to mimic the traditional silks of her people, but it just felt like wearing a plastic cage. The air in the room was overly recycled, carrying the faint, sterile odor of chemical bleach and old copper wiring. She stared at the wall. The metal panels hummed with the ambient vibration of the space station's core. She was 24. She was a bargaining chip. "It's time," Minister Hayes said from the doorway. He was a human, a tall, gaunt man with a suit that fit too well, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Diana didn't look at him. She simply nodded, adjusting the heavy collar around her neck, and walked out. The assembly hall was a cavern of forced diplomacy. Cameras blinked from the upper galleries. The air was thick with the scent of competing perfumes and the nervous sweat of 36 politicians who knew this treaty was built on wet sand. Diana walked down the central aisle, her posture rigid, her face locked into a mask of indifferent grace. Her stomach churned. She felt nauseous. Then she saw him. Her husband-to-be stood at the end of the aisle. He wasn't wearing a military uniform. He didn't have a chest full of medals or an energy sword strapped to his hip. He was wearing a dark blue suit that looked slightly too tight across his broad, sloping shoulders. He was thoroughly average. Brown hair thinning slightly at the temples, a thick, slightly crooked nose, and a jawline hidden under a neatly trimmed but unremarkable beard. He looked tired. As Diana reached the dais, he turned to her. His eyes were a washed-out hazel. He didn't look her up and down with possession or lust. He just looked at her with a heavy, quiet sort of resignation. "Diana," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone, but there was no command in it, just a rusty rasp. "Christian," she replied, the name feeling foreign and clumsy in her mouth. The officiant droned on, words about unity, shared futures, and the merging of two distinct peoples. Diana heard none of it. She was acutely aware of Christian's proximity. He smelled mundane, like sawdust, old fabric, and a faint, sharp undertone of mint soap. He was shifting his weight from left to right, his hands clasped awkwardly in front of him. When it came time to seal the pact, he extended his bare hand. Diana placed hers into it. His palm was warm, uncomfortably warm, and it was rough. Calluses lined the ridges of his fingers and the base of his palm, hard as cured leather. She expected him to grip her hand tightly, to assert dominance for the cameras. Instead, he held it loosely, almost gingerly, as if he were afraid she might break. "I'm sorry about the cameras," he muttered under his breath, barely moving his lips. "I know this is a circus." Diana blinked, caught off guard. She didn't respond. She just signed the data pad with her free hand, the digital ink sealing her fate. She was married. The war was over. And she belonged to a man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. The reception was a blur of flashing lights and polite, hollow conversations. Diana stood by the buffet, nursing a glass of watered-down synthetic wine. She watched Christian. He was backed into a corner by a group of her people's diplomats, nodding politely, holding a glass of amber liquid he hadn't taken a single sip from. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He rubbed the back of his neck, smiled a tight, apologetic smile, and excused himself. He caught her eye across the room and gestured subtly toward the exit. She set her glass down and followed. They walked in silence down the long, curved corridors of the station toward the docking bays. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the metal grates, her sharp, rhythmic clicks, his heavy, shuffling thuds. "You don't talk much," Diana said finally, the silence grating on her nerves. "Neither do you," Christian replied. He didn't look back. "Figured you had enough people talking at you today. I am supposed to be conversing with my new husband. It is expected." Christian stopped. He turned to face her, his hand shoved deep into his pockets. The harsh overhead lighting caught a faint pale scar running just beneath his jawline, fading into the hair of his beard. "Diana," he said, his voice flat but not unkind. "We both know what this is. I'm a retired mechanic. They pulled off a colony world because I fit the demographic profile your negotiators demanded. You're a noble from a house that lost too much money in the war. We did our duty. Now we're just two strangers going to a dirtball planet to live out a technicality." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "You don't have to pretend with me. Just tell me when I'm in your way, and I'll make myself scarce." Diana stared at him. The cynicism in his voice matched the bitter rot in her own chest. But hearing it said aloud felt like a slap. She bristled, her pride flaring. "I do not intend to spend the rest of my life avoiding you, Christian. We are bound. I will adapt." "Sure," he said softly, turning back toward the docks. "We'll adapt." The planet was called Harper's Reach, and it was a miserable rock. The sky was a perpetual bruised purple, and the air always tasted faintly of sulfur and wet soil. Their home was a prefabricated modular unit set on a sprawling patch of rocky land. It wasn't poor, but it was incredibly, agonizingly simple. 6 months passed, then 12, then 2 years. Diana hated the dirt. It got everywhere. It gathered in the corners of the windows, coated the solar panels, and stuck to the soles of her boots. Back in the capital, everything was polished chrome and sterile glass. Here, everything was coated in a fine, gritty film of reality. She stood by the kitchen window, watching the rain hammer against the thick plasteel glass. It wasn't real rain, not the gentle, romantic kind. It was thick, heavy drops of condensation that hit the roof with the sound of loose gravel. Outside, Christian was under the tractor. Again. He was wearing a faded gray jumpsuit stained black with grease. Only his legs were visible, sticking out from beneath the heavy machinery. The metallic clank of a wrench hitting a chassis echoed through the muddy yard. Diana took a sip of her coffee. It was a human brew, bitter, dark, and utterly devoid of the sweet narcotic properties her people enjoyed in their morning drinks. But she had grown used to it. The bitterness felt appropriate. She watched Christian slide out from under the tractor on a wheeled creeper. He sat up, wiping a smear of black grease from his forehead with the back of a filthy hand. He looked at the sky, squinting against the harsh rain, then patted the side of the tractor affectionately before jogging toward the house. The airlock hissed, and a moment later, he walked into the kitchen, shedding his wet boots by the door. He smelled of ozone, damp wool, and metallic oil. "Got the generator manifold patched," he announced, walking to the sink to scrub his hands with a harsh, granular soap. "Should keep the heat steady through the night." "Thank you," Diana said, her voice neutral. Christian dried his hands on a towel and poured himself a cup of the sludge from the pot. He leaned against the counter, blowing on the rim of the mug. He didn't ask how her day was. She didn't ask how his was. This was their rhythm. A quiet, comfortable sort of distance. But lately, the distance felt fragile. Diana found herself watching him when he didn't know it. She noticed the way he always sat facing the door when they went into the small colony town. She noticed the way he slept, rigid, completely still, never tossing or turning, like a corpse waiting for a spark. And there were the scars. She had seen them a few months ago when he had been chopping firewood in the yard, his shirt discarded in the stifling summer heat. His back was a map of violence, thick, jagged burns, puckered skin from puncture wounds, and long, straight surgical slices that spoke of deep, invasive repairs. When she had asked him about it, he just shrugged. "Mining accidents," he had mumbled, putting his shirt back on immediately. Diana wasn't stupid. She knew what mining accidents looked like. They crushed and snapped. They didn't leave perfectly circular entry and exit wounds. But she didn't press. She had her own secrets, her own resentments. She walked over to the dining table and picked up a data pad. The glowing screen displayed the latest news feeds from the core worlds. "The border talks are stalling again," she said quietly, tracing a finger over a headline. "Minister Hayes was denied entry to the upper council." Christian paused, his mug halfway to his mouth. For a fraction of a second, his posture stiffened. The lazy slouch evaporated, replaced by a rigid, tense line. Then he exhaled, and the slouch returned. "Politics," he grunted, taking a sip. "Nothing to do with us out here. We're old news." "If the treaty breaks, Christian, we are not old news. We are the first failure." He looked at her. His hazel eyes were dark in the dim kitchen light. "Nobody's coming all the way out to Harper's Reach to prove a point, Diana. Eat your breakfast. The bread's getting cold." He set his mug down and walked into the living room, picking up a physical paper book. He sat in his worn armchair, put on a pair of reading glasses that made him look painfully domestic, and opened the pages. Diana stared at his back. She felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of anger. He was so passive, so entirely detached. Didn't he care? Didn't he realize that her life, her entire existence, had been uprooted and planted in this muddy hellhole to keep a peace that was currently fracturing? "You are infuriating," she whispered to the empty kitchen. She didn't know if she hated him for his complacency, or if she hated herself for wishing he was the monster she had originally feared. At least a monster would fight. At least a monster would care. The attack didn't come with alarms or sirens. It came in the dead of night, announced only by the sudden, terrifying absence of sound. Diana woke up with a gasp. The rhythmic hum of the house's generator, a sound so constant she had stopped hearing it 2 years ago, was gone. The silence in the bedroom was suffocating. It was pitch black. The environmental controls had died, and the chill of the Harper's Reach night was already seeping through the floorboards. She sat up in bed, the sheets rustling loudly in the quiet. "Christian," she whispered. The bed beside her was empty. The sheets were cold. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. She swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet touching the freezing metal of the floor. "Christian!" she called out, slightly louder. A heavy hand clamped over her mouth from the darkness behind her. Diana thrashed, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kicked backward, trying to scream, but a thick, muscular arm wrapped around her waist, pinning her arms to her sides. "Shh," a voice breathed into her ear. It was a harsh, gravelly whisper. It was Christian. She stopped struggling, her chest heaving. He slowly released his hand from her mouth, but kept his arm tight around her, pulling her down into a crouch beside the bed. He smelled different. The stale coffee and engine grease were gone, washed away by a sharp, pungent odor of sour sweat and pure, metallic adrenaline. His chest, pressed against her back, was rising and falling in slow, deliberate, perfectly controlled intervals. "3 of them," Christian whispered, his lips barely moving against her ear. "Front door, back door, roof. Thermals are cut. Comms are jammed." Diana's mind raced. Assassins. The treaty had broken. Her own people or human extremists? It didn't matter. They were dead. They were unarmed on a dirt farm in the middle of nowhere. "Christian, what do we—" "Quiet." His voice wasn't the tired, apologetic tone she had listened to for 3 years. It was a blade sliding out of a sheath. It was absolute, freezing command. A faint creak echoed from the living room. The sound of a tactical boot stepping on the loose floorboard near the sofa. Diana trembled. She couldn't help it. Her knees shook so violently she thought they would rattle against the bed frame. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the flash of a plasma rifle, waiting for the searing heat. Christian moved. He didn't stand up. He slid forward across the floor with the silent, fluid grace of a predatory insect. Diana opened her eyes and watched him in the faint, ambient moonlight, filtering through the cracks in the window blinds. He had nothing in his hands. He was wearing nothing but a pair of loose gray sweatpants. A shadow filled the doorway of the bedroom. A massive figure, clad in matte black kinetic armor, holding a suppressed automatic rifle. The intruder's night vision goggles glowed with a faint, demonic red light. The intruder stepped into the room, sweeping the barrel of the rifle toward the bed. Christian didn't attack from the front. He rose from the dark corner near the doorframe, a silhouette of terrifying speed. Diana heard a wet, sickening crunch. She didn't see Christian punch or kick. She saw his hands latch onto the intruder's helmet, one hand under the chin, the other on the back of the armored crown. Christian twisted violently, stepping his entire body weight into the motion. The sound of thick carbon fiber armor and cervical bone snapping in unison was incredibly loud in the quiet room. The massive intruder went completely limp, dropping like a stone. Christian didn't let the body hit the floor. He caught the bulk of the dead weight, lowering it silently to the metal grating. In the same fluid, unbroken motion, he stripped the rifle from the dead man's grip and pulled a long, serrated combat knife from the sheath on the corpse's chest. He didn't hesitate. He didn't check the body. He stepped over it and melted into the hallway. Diana knelt by the bed, her hand clamped over her own mouth to trap the bile rising in her throat. The smell of voided bowels and sweat filled the room as the dead man's nervous system shut down. She was paralyzed. From the kitchen, a voice barked, a human voice. "Contact! Bedroom!" The voice cut off abruptly, not with a scream, but with a wet, gurgling gasp. Then came the sound of meat hitting a wall, a heavy, wet thump, the clatter of a dropped weapon, a desperate, frantic scuffling of boots against the floorboards, followed by the terrifying, unmistakable sound of a knife dragging through bone. Diana crawled toward the bedroom doorway, her lungs burning, desperate for air. She peered into the hallway. The living room was lit only by the pale moonlight shining through the rain-streaked windows. Christian was standing in the center of the room. A second body was on the floor, bleeding out from a catastrophic wound to the throat, a dark puddle expanding rapidly across the worn rug. The third assassin, a massive alien of the Grask species, easily standing 7 feet tall, had dropped his rifle and drawn a kinetic blade, cornered near the front door. The alien was panting, terrified, holding the humming blade defensively. Christian stood perfectly still. His chest and hands were coated in dark, slick blood. He held the combat knife loosely in his right hand. He wasn't panting. He wasn't angry. His face was an absolute, terrifying blank canvas. "Who sent you?" Christian asked. His voice was a flat, mechanical drone. There was no emotion, no fear, no rage, just a hollow calculation. The alien lunged, bringing the kinetic blade down in a sweeping arc. Christian didn't dodge backward. He stepped inside the guard. He moved faster than Diana's eyes could track, slipping past the glowing blade. He drove his left elbow up, shattering the alien's jaw with a crack like a gunshot. As the alien's head snapped back, Christian sank the combat knife into the soft tissue under the creature's armpit, driving it upward into the heart. He twisted the blade, stepped back, and let the giant collapse. 3 elite assassins, dead in less than 40 seconds. The silence returned to the house, broken only by the steady drum of rain on the roof and the wet drip of blood falling from Christian's fingertips. Diana sat on the floor, her back against the door frame, her entire body shaking. She couldn't breathe. The air smelled of copper, raw meat, and ozone. Christian stood among the corpses for a long moment, simply staring at the wall. Then, slowly, the rigid tension melted from his shoulders. He let the knife fall from his hand. It clattered against the floor. He turned to look at her. The moonlight caught his face. The cold, mechanical killer was gone, replaced by the tired, apologetic man she had known for 3 years. He looked at his blood-soaked hands, then at her terrified, wide eyes. "I'm sorry about the mess," he said softly. The smell of copper was thick enough to taste. It coated the back of Diana's throat, a heavy, cloying sweetness mixed with the raw, acidic stench of punctured intestines. Christian didn't wait for her to stop shaking. The apology still hung in the air, pathetic and absurd against the backdrop of 3 butchered corpses, but he had already moved on. He walked past her into the kitchen. The sound of running water echoed through the dark house. A moment later, he returned with a bucket, a heavy-duty scrub brush, and a massive jug of industrial chemical bleach. "Don't look at them," Christian said. He didn't look at her, either. He knelt beside the human assassin he had gutted in the hallway. Diana couldn't obey. Her eyes were locked onto the dead Grask near the door. The alien's jaw hung at an impossible, broken angle, the flesh swelling rapidly around the shattered bone. The blood pooling beneath it wasn't the bright red of a human, but a thick, viscous violet that stained the worn floorboards like spilled ink. "Christian," she rasped. Her voice sounded thin. It sounded like a child's. "Go to the bedroom, Diana. Put on your boots. The heavy ones. Grab the thermal coat from the closet. He poured bleach directly onto the floor. It hissed as it hit the blood, reacting violently. The fumes immediately burned her eyes, masking the slaughterhouse stench with blinding sterile chemistry. She pushed herself up, her hand slipping against the door frame. She looked down. Her fingers were smeared with red. She had touched the wall where the human had sprayed. A sharp, violent wave of nausea hit her. She doubled over, retching dryly onto the metal grating of the hall. Nothing came up but bitter stomach acid and the taste of the human coffee she'd forced down that morning. Christian stopped. He set the jug down. He didn't rush to her side or offer meaningless comfort. He just reached into his pocket, pulled out a relatively clean rag he used for engine grease, and held it out. "Wipe your hands, then get the boots." She snatched the rag, her chest heaving. The rough canvas scratched her skin as she scrubbed the blood off her fingers. It felt like trying to scrub off a shadow. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice finally finding an edge of hysteria. She pointed a trembling finger at the enormous dead alien. "You snapped a kinetic combat helmet with your bare hands. You moved like a ghost." "I'm your husband," he said evenly. He picked up the dead human by the collar of his tactical vest and dragged him effortlessly toward the back door, the boot heels leaving 2 thick red streaks across the wood. "And right now, I'm the only reason you're breathing. Boots. Coat. We have 10 minutes before their ship realizes they missed their check-in." Diana stumbled into the bedroom. The darkness felt different now. It wasn't the quiet peace of a farm at night. It was a void waiting to be filled with more monsters. She stripped off her silk nightclothes with frantic, tearing motions. She pulled on thick wool socks, heavy canvas trousers, and the insulated boots she usually wore to feed the generator. Every rustle of fabric made her flinch. When she walked back out, Christian was hauling the third body out the door into the pouring rain. The living room floor was a smeared, pinkish mess of bleach and water. Christian returned, drenched. The freezing rain washed the blood from his chest, leaving him pale and shivering slightly in the drafty house. He walked past her, straight to the center of the living room rug. He kicked the rug aside, exposing the bare floorboards. He knelt, ran his fingers along a seam in the wood that Diana had never noticed, and pressed hard. A dull click sounded. He pried up a section of the floor, revealing a long, sunken storage compartment lined with lead. Diana watched, her breath pluming in the cold air. He didn't pull out farm tools or spare credits. He pulled out a matte black rifle. It wasn't standard issue for any military she recognized. It was bulky, brutalist, and stripped of all identifying serial numbers or manufacturer stamps. He checked the action, the metallic clack-clack ringing out with terrifying familiarity in his hands. He tossed it onto the sofa. Next came a heavy tactical rig, worn at the edges but meticulously maintained. Then, a belt lined with compact explosive charges, an assortment of knives, and a sidearm that looked heavy enough to crack a man's skull, even without firing a shot. Lastly, he pulled out a thick armored trench coat. It was a faded charcoal gray. The left shoulder bore a patch that had been violently ripped off, leaving a scarred square of fabric. He began dressing. With every piece of gear he strapped to his body, the tired, slouching mechanic disappeared a little more. His posture straightened. The apologetic curve of his spine vanished, replaced by the rigid, coiled tension of a predator locking onto a scent. "Christian," Diana said. The anger was finally burning through her terror. "You are going to tell me what is happening. Right now, you lied to me. For 3 years." Christian racked the slide of the sidearm and holstered it at his thigh. He finally looked at her. The hazel eyes were dead. "I didn't lie," he said quietly. "You asked if I was a mechanic. I was. I fixed things that were broken." He grabbed the rifle and slung it over his shoulder. "Sometimes those things were tractors. Sometimes they were border disputes." He walked toward the door, pausing only to grab a heavy canvas bag from the hook. He tossed it to her. It was heavy, packed with dense ration bars and medical supplies. "If we stay here, the orbital strike will vaporize us in about 6 minutes, he said, turning the latch on the heavy front door. "Keep your head down. Step exactly where I step. If you fall behind, I won't stop for you." He opened the door. The roaring wind and driving rain swallowed them whole. The mud of Harper's Reach was notorious. It wasn't just dirt and water. It was a clay-heavy sludge that sucked at boots with a greedy, vacuum-like grip. Diana trudged behind Christian, the freezing rain lashing at her face. Her lungs burned. The heavy canvas bag dug into her shoulder, the strap chafing through her thick coat. They had been walking for nearly an hour, moving away from the colony town, deep into the jagged, barren hills that bordered their property. She couldn't see the path. There was no path. Only the faint silver glint of the moonlight catching the rain, and the broad, dark silhouette of her husband moving ahead of her. He didn't stumble. He didn't slip. He moved through the treacherous terrain with an infuriating, machine-like efficiency. Her leg plunged waist-deep into a hidden sinkhole of mud. She gasped, the icy water soaking through her trousers, instantly freezing her skin. She tried to pull her leg out, but the mud held fast. "Christian," she grunted, pulling frantically at her thigh. He stopped. He didn't sigh. He didn't complain. He simply turned, walked back, grabbed the collar of her coat with one hand, and yanked her upward. The suction popped loudly as she was pulled free, stumbling forward into his solid chest. She pushed away from him, her pride stinging worse than the cold. "I can walk," she snapped, though her teeth were chattering violently. "You're making too much noise," he whispered, his eyes scanning the ridgeline above them. "Because I am freezing to death in a swamp," she hissed back. "Where are we going? There is nothing out here but rock." Christian didn't answer. He turned and resumed climbing, his boots finding invisible footholds on the slick black stone. Diana swallowed her rage and followed. She had no choice. The memory of the dead assassins in her living room was a cold phantom pressing against her back. 10 minutes later, they crested a sharp ravine. The wind howled through the narrow gap, deafeningly loud. Christian led her down into the crevasse, into the suffocating pitch-black shadow of the overhanging cliffs. He stopped at a solid wall of rock. Diana leaned against the stone wall, gasping for air, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She watched as Christian brushed away a thick layer of clinging moss and dirt from the rock face. Beneath it wasn't stone. It was dull, gray metal, a keypad. He punched in a rapid sequence of numbers, his fingers moving purely from muscle memory. A heavy, hydraulic groan vibrated through the ground beneath their feet. The rock face shuddered, dirt and pebbles raining down on them, as a massive section of the cliff slowly recessed and slid to the side. Stale, dry air rushed out of the darkness, smelling faintly of ozone, old engine coolant, and dust. "Inside," Christian ordered, pushing her gently by the shoulder. Diana stumbled into the cavern. The heavy door groaned shut behind them, sealing away the sound of the storm. Total darkness engulfed them for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, amber emergency lights flickered to life along the ceiling. They were standing in a subterranean hangar. The concrete floor was cracked and covered in a fine layer of gray dust. In the center of the room sat a ship. It wasn't a standard civilian transport. It was a spearhead, matte black, angular, and bristling with hidden weapon ports. It looked predatory, designed purely for speed, stealth, and violence. The hull was scorched with old atmospheric burn marks, and the insignia on the side had been violently painted over, but the shape was unmistakable. Diana felt the blood drain from her face. She stepped backward, her boots scraping loudly on the concrete. "That is an interceptor," she whispered. Her voice echoed in the cavernous space. "A human military interceptor. They were all dismantled after the Accords." Christian walked past her, ignoring her shock. He approached the ship, ran a hand affectionately along the cold metal of the landing strut, and hit a manual release on the underside of the hull. A boarding ramp lowered with a sharp hiss of depressurization. "Most of them were," he agreed, walking up the ramp. Diana didn't move. She stared at the ship, pieces of the puzzle violently slamming together in her mind. The missing serial numbers on his rifle, the perfection of his hand-to-hand combat, the absolute absence of fear, the way he had snapped the Grask's jaw. "The treaty required a human of average standing," Diana said, her voice shaking, not from the cold, but from a profound, creeping terror. "A civilian, to marry a noble of my house. That was the bargain, a symbol of mutual demilitarization." Christian paused at the top of the ramp. He turned back to look at her. The amber emergency lights cast long, harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the pale scar along his jaw. "Your people demanded a civilian," Christian said, his voice flat. "My government agreed, but they didn't trust your house. They knew the hardliners in your parliament would try to break the treaty eventually. They needed a failsafe." "A failsafe," she repeated, the word tasting like ash. "They put me on Harper's Reach because it's a dead-end rock," he continued, leaning against the doorway of the ship. "Nobody looks here, nobody cares, and if your people ever decided to send a hit squad to sever the political tie, well, they wanted to make sure the hit squad didn't come back." "You were a plant," Diana breathed. "A bodyguard." "No," Christian said. The word was soft, but it carried a weight that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Bodyguards take bullets. I don't." He turned away and walked into the cockpit. The ship's interior lights hummed to life, casting a pale blue glow through the viewport. The low, throbbing vibration of a military-grade reactor spooling up shook the dust from the ceiling. Diana stood at the bottom of the ramp. She thought of the man who had sat in the worn armchair for 3 years, reading paper books and apologizing for bumping into door frames. It had been an act, every single second of it, a flawless, horrifyingly patient performance. She walked slowly up the ramp, entering the narrow utilitarian fuselage. The air inside was freezing. Christian was strapped into the pilot's seat, his hands flying across the control panels, flipping toggles and priming the thrusters. She stood behind him, staring at the back of his neck. "Who are you?" she asked again. This time, it wasn't a panicked demand. It was a surrender to the inevitable truth. Christian's hand stopped on the console. He stared out the viewport at the heavy glass door of the cavern. He didn't look back at her. "You read the histories of the war, Diana. You know the names of the battles." She frowned. "Of course. The siege of Vangelis, the burning of the Outer Rim, the Perseus Ridge." Christian's shoulders visibly tightened at the last name. He slowly flipped the main ignition switch. A deep, resonant hum filled the cabin. "At the Perseus Ridge," Christian said softly, his voice barely audible over the engines. "Your people had 3 entrenched battalions, heavy armor, plasma artillery. They held the valley for 6 months. No human strike force could break the line." Diana knew the story. It was a point of deep shame for her military. "Until the blackout," she said quietly. "Comms went dark, thermal imaging failed. When the sun came up, all 3 battalions were gone. The human media called it a strategic withdrawal." "It wasn't a withdrawal," Christian said. He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the profile of his face in the blue light of the monitors. The exhaustion in his eyes was absolute. "It was me and 4 other guys. We went in with knives and wire. It took us 9 hours. Diana stopped breathing. The floor of the ship seemed to tilt beneath her. He wasn't just a soldier. He was the ghost. The bogeyman her people whispered about in the academy halls. The demon of the Perseus Ridge. Christian turned back to the controls. He grabbed the heavy throttle lever. "Strap in, Diana. The orbital sensors are going to pick us up the second we breach the atmosphere. The piece is over." He pushed the throttle forward. "Now we survive." The acceleration didn't feel like flying. It felt like being crushed under the tread of a massive, indifferent machine. Diana's vision tunneled into a pinpoint of gray light as the interceptor tore out of the cliffside. The G-force slammed into her chest, an invisible concrete block that forced the air from her lungs in a pathetic, wheezing gasp. The heavy straps of the co-pilot seat dug violently into her collarbones. Around them, the ship didn't roar. It shrieked. It was the high-pitched, metallic scream of a hull fighting the atmosphere, tearing through the bruised purple clouds of Harper's Reach. "Breathe," Christian's voice crackled through the internal comms in her helmet. It was distorted, synthetic, utterly devoid of panic. "Short, shallow breaths through your teeth. Clench your legs. Don't let the blood drain from your head." Diana tried to obey, but her jaw was locked tight. The cockpit smelled of burning dust, the scent of a machine waking up after years of forced hibernation. Heat radiated from the console panels as the old wiring took the surge of the military-grade reactor. Through the thick plasteel viewport, the relentless rain turned to streaks of white ice, then instantly vaporized into glowing red plasma as friction superheated the nose of the ship. The violent shaking rattled her teeth so hard she tasted copper. Then the shaking stopped. The violent red glow outside the window snapped into the infinite, absolute black of the void, dotted with the harsh, unblinking light of distant stars. The crushing weight on her chest evaporated, leaving her stomach floating somewhere near her throat in the sudden microgravity. Christian's hands never stopped moving. He was flipping toggles, killing the primary thrusters, and engaging the dampeners. The ship went terrifyingly dark. Only the faint amber glow of the tactical displays illuminated his face. "We have company," he muttered, his fingers flying across a haptic keyboard. Diana turned her head, her neck stiff and sore. The radar screen between them blinked with 3 sharp red triangles. They were in high orbit, directly in the interceptor's path. "The assassin's transport?" she rasped. Her throat was raw from the dry, recycled air. "Corvettes," Christian corrected. 3 of them, fast, light armor, heavy scanners. They were waiting for the ground team to give the all clear. They just saw us punch a hole in the atmosphere. "Can we outrun them?" "In a straight line, yes. But they have missile locks. We don't." Christian pulled a heavy mechanical lever beside his seat. The interceptor shuddered as the weapons bays rotated open. "Strap tight, this is going to be ugly." The comms console crackled to life. A voice filled the cockpit, a human voice, speaking with the crisp, clipped accent of the core world military. "Unidentified vessel, this is Alliance Command. Cut your engines and prepare to be boarded. You are in violation of restricted airspace." Diana froze. "Alliance Command? Those are human ships? Christian, your own people sent the assassins?" Christian didn't answer her. He didn't answer the radio either. He reached up and manually severed the comms array. The resulting static was a harsh hiss before dying into silence. He gripped the yoke. The interceptor violently pitched to the left, diving toward the planetary debris ring. Red light flooded the cockpit. An automated voice droned. "Missile lock! Missile lock!" Diana squeezed her eyes shut. She waited for the explosion, the sudden depressurization, the freezing death of the void. Christian didn't flinch. He let the missiles close the distance. 10 seconds. 5 seconds. He watched the proximity radar with the bored, detached expression of a man waiting for water to boil. At the last possible fraction of a second, he slammed the thrusters into a reverse burn and dumped a payload of raw, unrefined thermal flare chaff out the rear bays. The ship snapped backward, throwing Diana violently against the harness. Through the viewport, the void erupted into blinding localized suns as the missiles detonated against the chaff. The shockwave rattled the interceptor's frame, but they were already gone, slipping through the expanding cloud of superheated plasma. Christian didn't fire lasers or plasma cannons. He didn't do a sweeping cinematic dogfight. He used the ship like a scalpel. He angled the interceptor beneath the belly of the closest human corvette, moving silently through the sensor-blind spot created by the explosion. He pressed a single red button on the yoke. A heavy, kinetic slug, a solid block of depleted uranium the size of an oil drum, fired from the nose of their ship. There was no bright flash, no laser beam, just the terrifying mechanical thunk of the railgun discharging. The slug tore through the underbelly of the Corvette. It didn't explode. It simply punched a hole straight through the reactor core and out the top of the hull. The Corvette went dark instantly, its internal lights dying as the ship died. A split second later, it fractured, the vacuum of space tearing the weakened hull apart in a silent, jagged bloom of frozen metal and atmosphere. Christian was already pulling away, calculating the jump coordinates on the navigation computer. "They're realigning," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Spooling the drift drive. 10 seconds." The remaining 2 corvettes opened fire. Streaks of blue plasma lashed through the dark, narrowly missing the interceptor's wing. One grazing shot clipped their rear deflector shield, sending a violent jolt through the cabin and shorting out half the console lights in a shower of sparks. "Christian!" Diana screamed over the blaring alarms. 3, he counted, ignoring her. 2, 1. He threw the main drift lever forward. The stars outside the viewport stretched into long, agonizing lines of white light. The violent shaking ceased, replaced by a deep, low-frequency hum that vibrated in Diana's teeth and the marrow of her bones. The ship slipped out of real space, plunging into the gray, featureless tunnel of the slipdrift. The alarms died. The red lights faded. They were gone. The silence in the drift was absolute. It wasn't the quiet of a country night. It was the dead, suffocating absence of reality. The only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical pulse of the life support cycler and the heavy breathing of the two people in the cockpit. Diana unbuckled her harness with trembling hands. Her fingers were stiff, her knuckles white. The moment the restraints released, the adrenaline crash hit her like a physical blow. She doubled over, pressing her forehead against the cold metal of the navigation console, and dry heaved. Her stomach was empty, but her body was desperate to purge the terror. Christian didn't offer a platitude. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew she wasn't. He unbuckled his own harness, stood up in the cramped space, and walked back into the narrow cargo hold. He returned a moment later with a foil packet of sterilized water. He unscrewed the cap and set it on the console near her hand. "Drink it slow," he said. He sat back heavily in his seat. The rigid posture he had maintained during the fight finally collapsed. The predator vanished, and the tired mechanic returned. He unzipped the heavy, armored trench coat and pulled it off, tossing it onto the floor grating. Underneath, his gray shirt was soaked with sweat and a dark, spreading stain of fresh blood. Diana wiped her mouth with the back of her sleeve, her breathing ragged. She looked at him, her eyes catching the blood. "You're hurt," she said, her voice hollow. Christian looked down at his side. He poked the fabric gingerly. "Grazed. The grass in the living room caught me with the edge of the kinetic blade when I stepped inside his guard. It cauterized as it cut. I'll live." He reached under the seat and pulled out a battered first aid kit. He peeled the shirt up, exposing the raw, angry burn across his ribs. He didn't wince as he sprayed a foul-smelling biofoam over the wound. The foam expanded, sealing the burn with a pale, rigid crust. Diana watched him, a strange, sickening knot of emotions twisting in her chest. For 3 years, she had lived with a man she believed was entirely unremarkable. She had watched him fix plumbing, read books, and apologize for existing. Now the smell of the cabin, sweat, burned ozone, and the coppery tang of old blood told the truth. "Your own government," she said, breaking the heavy silence. "They were human ships, Christian. They fired on you. The failsafe." Christian taped a gauze pad over the foam. He didn't look at her. "The failsafe was designed to protect the treaty from your people. If human command sent the hit squad, it means the human government doesn't want the treaty anymore, either." "Why?" Diana demanded, sitting up straight. The fear was receding, replaced by the cold, sharp instincts of the diplomat she had been trained to be. "The war nearly bankrupted both our species. The outer rim is still a graveyard. Why break the peace?" "Because peace is expensive. War is profitable," Christian said flatly. He leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes. "Someone in the upper echelons needs an excuse to restart the machine. The easiest way to do that is to assassinate a high-ranking alien noble married to a human civilian on a border world. They blame your extremist factions. They blame pirates. It doesn't matter. The blood is spilled, the outrage is manufactured, and the fleets launch. They sent assassins to kill me, Diana whispered. And you. They sent assassins to kill you, Christian corrected gently. They sent assassins to die to me, or for me to die to them. I don't think command cared which way it went, as long as the house burned down. Diana stared at the side of his face. The deep, exhausted lines around his eyes. The graying hair at his temples. At the Perseus Ridge, she started, her voice barely a breath. My instructors said the human strike force was ruthless, that they slaughtered the sleeping, that they felt nothing. Christian opened his eyes. He didn't turn his head. He just looked straight ahead at the swirling gray mist of the slipdrift outside the viewport. Your instructors weren't there, he said. His voice was scraped clean of any emotion. It was utterly barren. We didn't feel nothing. We felt everything. Every rib cracking, every throat tearing, every dying breath of a kid who was drafted into a war he didn't understand. He slowly turned his head to look at her. The hazel eyes were dark, haunted by ghosts she could never comprehend. I didn't kill them because I wanted to, Diana. I killed them because command pointed at the valley and said, clear it. I was a tool, a hammer. When the war ended, they didn't know what to do with the hammer. So they put me in a box. They gave me a wife, a farm, and a broken tractor to keep me quiet. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I liked the farm. I liked the dirt. It was honest. Diana felt a sudden, unexpected sting of tears in her eyes. Not for herself, but for the profound, tragic waste of the man sitting beside her. He wasn't a living god of war. He was a deeply damaged man who just wanted to be left alone. Where are we going? She asked quietly. Nowhere safe, Christian replied. He reached forward and began tapping coordinates into the nav computer. The core worlds are out. The border colonies will be crawling with alliance sweeps by morning. We're going to the Terminus Belt. It's pirate territory, lawless. The alliance won't follow us there without risking a larger incident. Pirates, Diana repeated, the word tasting like rust. I am a diplomat, a noble of the highest house, and now I am a fugitive hiding with thieves. Christian finished the sequence and locked the console. He looked at her, and for the first time since the attack began, a faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. You're not a diplomat anymore, Diana. Diplomats negotiate. We are way past talking. He leaned back, resting his hands on his lap. Get some sleep. The drift takes 8 hours. When we drop out, we drop into the dark. The ship hummed its lonely song, carrying a dead man and a ruined noble deeper into the void. The exit from Slipdrift wasn't a smooth transition. It was a violent, teeth-rattling crash back into real space that felt like being rear-ended by a freight train. Diana's harness locked hard against her collarbones, knocking the air from her lungs in a sharp wheeze. Outside the viewport, the featureless gray tunnel shattered into a chaotic spray of jagged starlight and floating debris. The interceptor's proximity alarm shrieked immediately, flooding the dark cockpit with strobing red light. Christian's hands were a blur over the console, ripping the main thrusters into a brutal deceleration burn. He didn't blink. The muscles in his forearms stood out like steel cables under his pale skin. We're clear, he grunted, slamming his palm onto a kill switch that silenced the alarms. Diana swallowed hard, her ears popping as the cabin pressure equalized. She looked out the viewport. They weren't in deep, empty space. They had dropped directly into the heart of a massive swirling asteroid field. Massive chunks of iron-rich rock, some the size of small moons, tumbled silently through the void. Tethered between the largest asteroids was a sprawling, chaotic mess of architecture. It was a station built from the scavenged corpses of hundreds of dead ships, freighters welded to military cruisers, civilian transports lashed together with thick, braided steel cables. There were no polished chrome spires here, no illuminated billboards or manicured docking rings. The terminus belt looked exactly like what it was, a rusted, festering wound on the edge of civilized space. "Tether station," Christian said, reading her expression. "It's a chop shop. Smugglers, pirates, deserters. They don't ask questions, and they don't broadcast alliance beacons. They will also cut our throats for the boots on our feet," Diana replied, her voice tight. "Only if we look like easy prey." Christian unbuckled his harness. He moved slower now. The adrenaline of the escape had burned off, leaving behind the heavy, crushing toll of his injuries. He pressed a hand against his ribs, his breath catching slightly, before forcing himself to stand straight. He walked back into the small armory behind the cockpit. When he returned, he tossed a heavy, blunt-nosed kinetic pistol into Diana's lap. She stared at the weapon. It was ugly. It smelled of gun oil and old sweat. "I am not a soldier," she said, refusing to touch it. "You're a fugitive," Christian countered. He strapped his own tactical rig over his blood-stained shirt, checking the action of his rifle. "Tuck it into your waistband. Keep the safety on. I don't need you to shoot anyone. I just need the scum on that station to see the grip of the gun when your coat falls open. Out here, being unarmed is a provocation." Diana hesitated, her aristocratic pride violently warring with her basic survival instinct. Slowly, she picked up the cold, heavy metal. She shoved it awkwardly beneath the belt of her trousers, pulling the thick wool coat over it. It dug uncomfortably into her hip, a constant heavy reminder of how far she had fallen in 24 hours. The docking sequence was rough. The interceptor clamped onto an exterior airlock with a jarring metallic thud. When the ramp lowered, the smell hit Diana like a physical wall. It was a suffocating cocktail of unwashed bodies, burning engine coolant, cheap synthetic alcohol, and the sharp, acidic tang of raw sewage. The hangar was a cavernous, dimly lit scrapyard. Sparks rained down from overhead gantries, where men and aliens in heavy welding gear tore apart stolen freighters. Christian led the way, his rifle slung across his chest, but easily within reach. He walked with a heavy, deliberate limp, yet his posture radiated an intense, coiled violence that made the dock workers instinctively step out of his path. They navigated a maze of narrow, dripping corridors until they reached a heavy blast door guarded by two massive thugs with cybernetic eye implants. "We need a scrub," Christian said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Full core wipe, new ID transponder." The larger guard sneered, looking Diana up and down. "Boss Sutton is busy. Come back tomorrow." Christian didn't argue. He didn't posture. He simply reached out, grabbed the guard's cybernetic eye with his left hand, and drove his right thumb directly into the soft tissue of the man's throat. The guard choked, his knees buckling instantly as Christian pressed him against the blast door. Tell Boss Sutton, Christian whispered into the gasping man's ear, that the Perseus ghost is knocking, and he's tired. The second guard froze, his hand hovering over his holster. He looked at Christian's dead, exhausted eyes, then hit the door release. The office inside was a smoke-filled den of luxury built on garbage. A fat, balding human wearing a garish silk shirt sat behind a desk piled with data pads and weapon parts. This was Sutton. Sutton looked up, annoyed, but the annoyance vanished the second he recognized Christian's face. The blood drained from the pirate's cheeks. "Artie," Sutton breathed, raising his hands slowly. "Christ, I thought you were dead." "I was," Christian said, dropping a heavy leather pouch of raw platinum credits onto the desk. "I need the interceptor in Bay 4 scrubbed, top to bottom, new registry. I need it in 2 hours." Sutton eyed the platinum, then looked at Diana. His eyes narrowed. He picked up a data pad, tapped the screen, and turned it around. On the screen was a glaring red bounty notice. It featured a high-resolution image of Diana's face and a slightly blurrier image of Christian's, wanted for high treason and terrorism. Reward, 50 million credits, dead or alive. "This just came across the dark net 10 minutes ago," Sutton said, his voice slicking with newfound greed. "Alliance Command is screaming for your heads, Artie. 50 million. That's a lot of platinum." Christian shifted his weight. His hand dropped a fraction of an inch toward the sidearm at his thigh. The atmosphere in the room crystallized into pure, freezing tension. Sutton's hands twitched toward a hidden button under his desk. Diana stepped forward. She moved smoothly, sliding past Christian, her posture perfectly straight. She didn't look like a terrified refugee. She looked like the reigning heir of a high noble house. 50 million credits, Diana said, her voice dripping with absolute freezing condescension. A staggering sum for a mechanic in a scrapyard. Tell me, Mr. Sutton, how exactly do you plan to collect it? Sutton blinked, caught off guard. I hold you here. I call the Alliance. And then what? Diana laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. You invite an Alliance Black Ops strike team to Tether Station? They will not hand you a briefcase of credits. They will vaporize this entire asteroid to ensure no witnesses remain. They are covering up an illegal assassination, Mr. Sutton. They will not leave a pirate alive who knows their secrets. She leaned over the desk, planting her palms flat on the metal, invading Sutton's space. She let her coat fall open just enough for the heavy grip of the pistol to show. You take the platinum my husband offered, Diana said, her tone dropping to a lethal whisper. You scrub our ship, and you live to spend it, or you make a call, and this station burns to ash before dinner. Choose. Sutton stared at her. He looked at Christian, who was watching Diana with a faint, genuine glimmer of surprise. Sutton swallowed hard. He swept the pouch of platinum into a desk drawer. 2 hours, Sutton muttered. Bay 4. Don't be late. The 2 hours felt like peeling off an open wound. They sat in a rusted cantina near the docking bay, nursing synthetic water. Christian looked gray. The biofoam on his side was holding, but the blood loss was taking its toll. His hands shook slightly as he lifted his cup. You handled Sutton, Christian said quietly. I have spent my entire life negotiating with vipers in the capital, Diana replied, staring at her own reflection in the filthy metal table. Sutton is just a viper with worse hygiene. Christian let out a dry, raspy chuckle. It was the first time she had ever heard him genuinely laugh. It sounded like sandpaper on wood. The laugh was cut short by a sound that made Diana's blood run cold. It was a deep, resonant boom that shook the deck plating beneath their feet. The cantina lights flickered and died, replaced by the sickly red glow of emergency backups. Screams erupted from the main concourse. "Sutton sold us out," Diana hissed, reaching for the pistol in her waistband. "No," Christian said, standing up. He grabbed his rifle. "Sutton is a coward. He wouldn't risk his station. The Alliance just didn't wait for a tip. They tracked our slip-drift trajectory. They're here." They burst out of the cantina into the main corridor. It was pandemonium. Smugglers and pirates were scattering like roaches, diving into side alleys and locking down blast doors. At the far end of the concourse, the bay doors blew inward in a shower of molten slag. Through the smoke stepped 6 figures in heavy Alliance Black Ops armor. They moved in perfect, terrifying unison, their kinetic rifles sweeping the crowd, cutting down anyone stupid enough to run in their direction. "Go!" Christian shoved Diana toward a narrow maintenance access tunnel branching off the main hall. "Christian, there are 6 of them." "I've killed more with a broken shovel," he snarled, pushing her into the dark tunnel. "Get to the ship. Spool the drive. If I'm not there in 5 minutes, you leave." Diana stumbled into the dark tunnel. She looked back just in time to see Christian step out into the open concourse. He didn't fire his rifle. He unpinned a high-explosive thermite charge from his belt, threw it directly at the ceiling support struts above the strike team, and dove behind a heavy cargo loader. The explosion was deafening. The ceiling collapsed, dropping 10 tons of reinforced steel and crushed rock directly onto the rear flank of the squad. 2 men were crushed instantly. The remaining 4 spun, their rifles lighting up the concourse, shredding the cargo loader Christian was hiding behind. Diana didn't run to the ship. She couldn't. She watched her husband fight. He moved with a sickening, liquid grace. When the suppression fire paused for a fraction of a second to reload, Christian broke cover. He didn't shoot. He closed the distance. He tackled the closest soldier, driving the stock of his rifle directly into the man's visor. The plasteel shattered, and Christian followed through with a brutal, point-blank shot to the chest. 3 left. One of them managed to flank him. A burst of plasma fire clipped Christian's shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped to one knee, grunting in pain, his rifle skittering across the floor. The soldier stepped up, aiming down the sights, preparing to execute him. Diana didn't think. The paralyzing fear that had gripped her in the farmhouse was gone, burned away by the fury of betrayal. She stepped out of the tunnel, raised the heavy kinetic pistol with both hands, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was immense, throwing her arms upward and nearly snapping her wrists. The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed through the hall. The slug tore through the gap in the soldier's neck armor. He collapsed, a spray of arterial blood painting the wall behind him. Christian didn't waste the distraction. He lunged from the ground, drawing the combat knife from his boot in one motion, and buried it in the thigh of the next soldier, severing the femoral artery. He ripped the man's sidearm free as he fell, and put a single round through the visor of the final, panicked squad member. Silence slammed back into the concourse, broken only by the crackle of electrical fires and the wet gurgle of dying men. Christian stood slowly. He was clutching his bleeding shoulder, his breathing heavy and ragged. He turned and looked at Diana. The heavy pistol was still shaking in her hands, a wisp of gray smoke curling from the barrel. He walked over to her. He didn't take the gun, he just gently pushed her arms down. "Nice shot," he rasped. "My ears are ringing," she said numbly. "You'll get used to it." He grabbed her shoulder. "Come on, Bay 4. They limped into the hangar. The interceptor was waiting, the new registry codes blinking on the external display. They boarded, the ramp ceiling behind them with a hiss that sounded like a locked vault. Christian collapsed into the pilot's seat, his hands immediately flying across the pre-flight checklist. Diana strapped into the co-pilot seat. She didn't look away from him this time. The ship shuddered, tearing away from the station and diving deep into the protective cover of the asteroid field, slipping past the massive Alliance cruiser parked outside the belt. The blue glow of the drift drive spooling illuminated the cockpit. "We can never go back," Diana said softly. "Not to my people, not to yours. We are dead to both of them." Christian locked the coordinates. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes. His face was smeared with soot and blood, the scars illuminated by the console lights. "I've been dead for years, Diana," he said quietly. Diana looked down at her hands. They were bruised, blistered, and smeared with grease. She wasn't a noble anymore. The silk dresses and the polished capital were ashes. But as she looked at the ruined, brutal man sitting beside her, she felt something she hadn't felt since the day she signed the marriage treaty. She felt free. "Then I suppose we have nothing left to lose," Diana said. "When we drop out of the drift, teach me how to shoot properly." Christian opened his eyes. He looked at her, a slow, tired smirk pulling at the corner of his scarred mouth. "Okay," he said. He pushed the throttle forward. "Hold on." The stars stretched into lines of blinding white light, and the ghost of the Perseus Ridge disappeared into the dark, carrying the spark of a new war with him. Did you expect that from Christian? Sometimes the quietest men harbor the loudest storms. If this gritty, brutal dive into humanity's hidden fury hooked you, don't leave just yet. Hit that like button to feed the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a sci-fi drop, and drop a comment below. What do you think Christian and Diana's next move against the Alliance will be? Share this video with your fellow HFY fans and stick around for more stories where the blood really hits